The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
On the last day of Passover over the weekend, another white supremacist opened fire at a synagogue, and this was exactly 6 months after the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting. This time it was at Chabad of Poway in Poway, California. Maybe it's pronounced Poway. The shooter was a 19-year-old white supremacist, killed one woman, injured 3 other people, including the rabbi at the synagogue. The shooter, not super surprisingly, had an AR-style rifle on him when he was arrested. And yeah, I mean, importantly, the shooter was arrested, not killed. A 60-year-old woman was killed, Lori Gilbert Kay, who had jumped in the way of the rabbi to protect the rabbi from the shooter. The rabbi ended up getting shot in the hand, I believe had surgery and is okay, but the woman was the one person killed. There was an off-duty Border Patrol officer in the synagogue, just as a congregant, who opened fire in response to the shooter and actually hit the shooter's car, but the shooter was able to leave at the time uninjured, and eventually the shooter was captured 2 miles away from the synagogue. And every detail that we've learned about this shooter is sadly completely unsurprising. The shooter had written an anti-Semitic and racist letter, which was posted on the internet message board 4chan. The shooter blamed Jews for perpetuating a genocide against the European race. Of course, European race is white nationalist, white supremacist code for white people, a common trope of the white supremacist movement in 2019. The shooter said that Hitler, as well as other previous white supremacist shooters, including the one from the Pittsburgh synagogue, were inspirations to him. And this is once again the type of extremism that has been catalyzed and coalesced and emboldened by Donald Trump. Now, I'm not blaming Donald Trump for the specific shooting. And if you're going to just write to me saying, David, why are you blaming Trump? Just save your breath or your typing. I don't know, whatever. Just don't do it. Because I'm not blaming Trump. What I'm telling you once again is that anti-Semitic incidents went up in 2017. They went up in 2018. Anti-Semitic online hate is up as tracked by the Center on Extremism. Anecdotally, anti-Semitic comments to me are way up. Not that that tells us anything about the broader numbers. It's just an anecdote. Trump personally being an anti-Semite, who knows, who cares? His son-in-law is Jewish. It's doubtful that Trump is sort of consciously, openly anti-Semitic. Trump didn't create anti-Semites, but Trump has been signaling to these anti-Semites and white supremacists, as they have straight up told me on the show. I mean, they've said it to me when I've interviewed them. They see Trump as the closest thing to what they would like in a president. The signaling on Hispanic people, on the S-hole countries, all of that stuff. And so the rhetoric rises. The anti-Semites who already exist are emboldened, and the proof is in the numbers that we are seeing. And sadly, the attacks on media by Trump also make it a lot tougher to fight anti-Semitism, because the way it works is when media reports, hey, anti-Semitism is way up, people who are not themselves anti-Semitic but have fallen for Trump's fake news, the news is lying stuff, they just don't believe the reports about anti-Semitism. They call them just another example of the attempt to attack Donald Trump. When will Trump actually say, we do have a problem with anti-Semitism and white supremacists in this country? Because we now have the Poway synagogue, white supremacist, the Tree of Life synagogue, white supremacist, the Oak Creek Sikh temple, white supremacist. We've had instances in Canada. We also have the New Zealand Christchurch shooting, white supremacists who, they don't exist because of Donald Trump. Donald Trump didn't make them white supremacists. Donald Trump didn't make them white nationalists or anti-Semites, but they're emboldened. They're taking action. They've been coalesced. Why is it so difficult for Donald Trump just to say, we have a problem with white supremacy and anti-Semitism in this country, and we're committed to dealing with it? I think there's a real question there. I'm not asking it rhetorically. I actually want to know, why won't Donald Trump say it? The easy answer is because he's anti-Semitic. I think the truth is far more complicated than that. I think that's too simplistic of an explanation, but I'd love to hear from you what you think is going on there. Every day that goes by, there is less of a debate as to whether Donald Trump obstructed justice. The debate is, how badly, how brazenly did Donald Trump obstruct justice? Is there any way to make Donald Trump face consequences for obstructing justice? And is Donald Trump going to get away with obstruction of justice? And along these lines, over the weekend, we learned that prosecutors working for Robert Mueller are now saying, yes, Donald Trump obstructed justice. There's a bombshell article in the New York Review of Books which points out that this is not even a recent conclusion that Mueller's prosecutors came to. So let's take a step back and reset so that we all have all of the necessary information here. In the Mueller report, Mueller wrote that there was, quote, substantial evidence that Donald Trump obstructed justice, but that ultimately Mueller did not move to indict the president because of the legal mess that indicting a sitting president would create, and because it would interfere with Donald Trump being able to carry out his duties of the presidency if he were to be indicted. That's horrifying, okay? These were political reasons not to indict Donald Trump for obstruction, not legal reasons. But let's take a step back from that for a second. We've now learned that two prosecutors working for Robert Mueller concluded last year that they had evidence to indict Donald Trump for obstruction, specifically for pressuring former FBI Director James Comey before he fired him to end the investigation into Michael Flynn. Once again, they said, we had the evidence that Trump should be indicted, but because of the complexity of indicting a sitting president, we didn't go forward with that indictment. This is all in an article written over the weekend by Murray Waas in the New York Review of Books, based on what two of Robert Mueller's prosecutors told other law enforcement officials. This eventually became Donald Trump's hand-picked Attorney General William Barr saying, I'm not going to charge Donald Trump with a crime. Obviously, that wasn't a surprise. And this is how you get a president out of trouble, which William Barr is an expert in doing. William Barr has been getting presidents out of trouble for decades. And now it goes beyond just pressuring Comey to end the probe into Michael Flynn. There are, if you looked at the Mueller report, and if you haven't and you're writing to me about it, what are you doing? Read the Mueller report. There are 11 instances of possible obstruction by Donald Trump in the Mueller report. Another example was when Trump tried to fire Robert Mueller. He told White House counsel Don McGahn, go and fire Robert Mueller. Don McGahn just straight up refused, realizing that that was a disastrous idea. There are other examples of Trump obstructing justice, trying to, for example, influence or intimidate witnesses against him. So this is how it happens. Unless you actually do the work, if you don't read the Mueller report, if you don't go and do the investigative journalism, if you're just like a normal person who lives your life, you're busy earning a paycheck, you're busy getting your kids to school, you hear like 1% of the story. You hear 2-year investigation, Trump said no obstruction, no collusion, William Barr said it, Trump bragged about it. That's basically all the information you get. But when you dig into it, you realize that Mueller went out of his way in the report multiple times to say he can't clear Trump of obstruction, meaning there is a ton of evidence of obstruction. There is a ton of evidence that Donald Trump is a criminal obstructor. And remember that Robert Mueller actually wrote, quote, if we had confidence after a thorough investigation of the facts that the president clearly did not commit obstruction of justice, we would so state. The evidence we obtained about the president's actions and intent presents difficult issues that prevent us from conclusively determining that no criminal conduct occurred. If you don't take the time to look and to read this stuff, and it's okay, most Americans don't because they have lives that don't revolve around legal documents in Washington, D.C., they think Trump has been totally cleared. They actually believe he's been exonerated. But if you go back and you look at the evidence and you look at reports and testimony, you realize that there is criminal obstruction, that prosecutors believed they found criminal obstruction, but they didn't indict because it's politically difficult to indict a president. William Barr propagandized this into no crime, Trump's a victim, and that's the narrative that Trump and his advisors and his aides and Fox News have been running with. So what needs to happen now? Number one, the House of Representatives has to subpoena Robert Mueller and has to subpoena the prosecutors to get them to say this under oath. You've got to establish that under oath. The only reason there wasn't an indictment against Trump is that he's the president, and you've got to get that in testimony. And William Barr needs to be held accountable for repeatedly making false characterizations of what investigators concluded. This is not a political game, okay? This is the foundation on which the country is built, and some of the most important questions that can be asked need to be asked. Is the president immune from criminality? Are they more like an unchecked monarch in practice, or is this still the United States of America as originally designed? And for people who were saying, but David, it's legalese in the report. It should have been made more clear if Trump actually obstructed justice. For legal language, this is as clear as it gets. For each of the 11 counts, they talk in the report about the elements that are needed to show obstruction. And they say, we cannot clear Trump. If we could clear him, we would say it. That's in the report. And then Barr's interpretation makes it all seem inconclusive, makes it impossible to really know. Wrong. Forget about what Barr said. The report says, here's evidence of obstruction in 11 instances. Some of them have more evidence. Some of them have less. The Justice Department doesn't indict sitting presidents, but we cannot clear Trump. And by the way, there's a very interesting footnote 1090 or 1091 of the report, which says, impeachment does not substitute indictment after the president is no longer in office. And we're going to talk about that tomorrow. But the media fell for it. They were very easily manipulated. Americans are busy living their lives. They're not going to be going and looking at the footnotes of a 448-page report. And they did it. They got away with it unless something changes. And it's a truly sick reality that we are likely going to have to deal with, the remedy being voting in 2020, as we always knew that it would be. Let me know what you think. I'm on Twitter at @dpacman, and the show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is Tanya Jackson. Tanya, thank you so much for being a supporter of the show. If you believe that programs like the David Pakman Show matter, that they're valuable, then please consider supporting us by becoming a member at joinpakman.com. Someone who signed up almost 5 years ago and is today's all-star, longtime, sustaining member of the day is David Tyler. Tanya and David, thank you so much. You can join them using the coupon code THISIS2020 to save 40% off of any of the memberships at joinpakman.com. Okay, so we've been talking more and more about Donald Trump's impeachment and calls for impeachment, and I want to step back from that for a moment and just talk about sort of some historical parallels between Richard Nixon in 1974 and Donald Trump in 2019. And the top-level parallels are pretty obvious, right? At the top level, we have attempts to obstruct investigations into their respective presidencies, cover-up attempts. And this is the kind of broadest way in which Nixon 74 and Trump 2019 are similar. But as Kelby Adams points out in a really good multi-post thread on Twitter, articles of impeachment against Nixon were filed in part for using his power as president directly and through subordinates to impede and obstruct an investigation into the Watergate Hotel break-in. The second part of the Nixon impeachment articles was for violating the constitutional rights of citizens or contravening the laws governing agencies of the executive branch. When you look at the Mueller report, it literally spells out examples of Trump doing the same thing all over the place. If you look at pages 77 and 113 of the first volume of the report, if you look at pages 177 and 178 of part 2, pay special attention to footnote 1091 about impeachment not substituting criminal liability in the Mueller report, which maybe we'll talk about tomorrow, we learn that Donald Trump prevented aides from testifying before Congress, another example of obstruction. And there are a whole bunch of other examples we could go through, which already gives us parallels for 2 out of 3 of the impeachment articles filed against Richard Nixon that we can find in the Trump administration. Then we get to the third part of Nixon's articles of impeachment, quote, failing without lawful cause or excuse to produce papers and things as directed by duly authorized subpoenas issued by the Committee on the Judiciary of the House of Representatives. This is part 3 of Nixon impeachment articles, and it exploded over the weekend for Donald Trump. We found out that Trump has been directing his entire administration to simply not provide documents, not respond to subpoenas, not show up and testify when it comes to some individuals in the Justice Department. And this is above and beyond the tax returns, okay, which aren't even really a part of this. Donald Trump and everyone around him have tried to use their power to obstruct a full investigation into a whole bunch of different stuff, including the Trump Tower meeting, including financial crimes, on and on and on. So there are a lot of similarities if you look at the articles of impeachment of Richard Nixon. But then let's go even further. Trump and Nixon both hated and regularly attacked the media. Trump's framing is, if not for the press unfairly targeting me, none of this impeachment talk would even been going on. Would even have been going on. None of the Mueller probe, or a lot of the Mueller probe, would never have gotten going if it weren't for the evil press. Nixon had almost the same position. Nixon thought that the media made him lose to John F. Kennedy in 1960. He would regularly ramble against the media, et cetera, and very, very similar attacks. When you look at presidential power, Nixon at his core didn't care about the limits of presidential power. Trump similarly doesn't, obstructing investigations, installing puppet cabinet members, firing people and trying to fire even more people. One of those that he failed to get fired was Robert Mueller himself when Don McGahn said, I'm not going to do it. Both Nixon and Trump lost top-level staff to scandals and criminality. That was part of the bigger picture of what was going on in the Nixon administration, and there's a long list of people that both Trump and Nixon lost. I won't name them all. Former elected Republican officials, some Republicans are now running for office who are saying it's time for Trump to go. But ultimately, what saves Trump is a key difference between 1974 and 2019. In 1974, eventually, it became known to Nixon that elected Republicans were turning on him. Elected Republicans recognized they are not going to be able to continue their support for President Nixon, and it is going to have to be a yes vote on conviction on impeachment. And that is ultimately what caused Richard Nixon to resign. I don't know that you're going to see that with Donald Trump in 2019, because Republicans in 1974 were willing to go beyond partisanship, and they realized Nixon horribly damaged the country and he needs to be removed. So far, we have not seen that same point of view from any prominent current elected Republicans. We've seen it from some former Republicans. We've seen it from George W. Bush's former speechwriter. We see it from William Weld, who's running a primary campaign against Donald Trump. But you need 2/3 of the Senate to convict on impeachment. Democrats can't do it now. Democrats can't even do it if they do well in 2020 in the Senate, because you need a 2/3 majority, which Democrats are not going to have after the 2020 election. So unless 2019 becomes like 1974, in that Republicans realize this is just bad for the country, we have to cross party lines here, you are not going to see impeachment of the President of the United States. One other note on this. Impeachment of Nixon actually failed before it succeeded in getting him to resign. Before the Watergate break-in in 72, some Democrats already believed that it was time to impeach Nixon. You had House resolutions 975, 976, and 989. They were all submitted to the House Judiciary, and they went nowhere in 72. In 73, there was an attempt to impeach Nixon for something unrelated to the Watergate break-in, for Nixon's secret bombing of Cambodia. Articles of impeachment were introduced by Congressman Robert Drinan at the time, and that didn't go anywhere. So understand that these are very long processes. And at this point in time, aside from my opinion as to whether Trump should be impeached, I genuinely would not be able to say whether the evidence suggests impeachment is or is not likely, because if history tells us anything, these things can be extraordinarily unpredictable and have a very, very long time period during which they develop. We will see the similarities between Nixon 74 and Trump 2019 growing by the day. Let's talk now about Donald Trump's position on a lot of this stuff. For someone who says that he doesn't want to get impeached, Donald Trump is really behaving like someone who is trying to get Democrats to impeach him. We've been talking a lot about the growing demands for Trump's impeachment. We've been talking about Trump's behavior exposed by the Mueller report. We've been talking about the strategy behind impeachment. Does it make sense strategically? We've talked about the ethics behind it. But there is a completely separate issue that is growing here, which is that Donald Trump's actions in the last 2 weeks are starting to force the hands of Democrats who may end up with no credible option but to impeach the president of the United States. And if you're wondering, what has Trump been doing for the last couple of weeks, David? I will tell you what he's been doing. The third article of impeachment against Richard Nixon, I mentioned this in the last segment. We already talked about it. Donald Trump is increasingly sort of in contempt of Congress. Donald Trump has directed his administration straight up to fight every congressional subpoena, to stonewall every request from Congress, and to make it as close to impossible as they can for an actual investigation to take place. Even Nancy Pelosi, who said she's against impeachment, that Trump's not worth impeachment, which angered a lot of Democrats when she said it in, I think it was March. Even Nancy Pelosi said, we have to investigate before we can even say if impeachment is on the table. And Trump is blocking every single request that's part of that investigation. And this is a huge part of why more and more Democrats are now talking about impeachment. I already told you last week, Elizabeth Warren, Kamala Harris, Elijah Cummings, Maxine Waters, George W. Bush's former speechwriter, AOC, a mix of people in and out of elected office. Now Donald Trump is stonewalling investigations, and more names are adding themselves to the list. Congressman Jamie Raskin, current member of Congress, says, I have a hunch that he is moving the whole caucus closer to seeing impeachable offenses. What is Trump stonewalling so far? Trump AG William Barr might not show up to testify. Trump directed all records requests from the Oversight Committee to be fought. This is the job of the Oversight Committee, and the president is obstructing them from being able to do that job. The House Intel Committee is trying to look into Donald Trump's finances. The administration is ignoring all requests. The Justice Department hasn't even responded to document requests. Top Justice Department lawyer John Gore is going to ignore a subpoena to testify. I challenge so-called constitutional conservatives who say they believe in checks and balances put in place by the founders to just denounce this, okay? If you're a Trumpist of moral substance, maybe there are some out there, I want to hear from you. Contact me and tell me you like Trump, you want Trump reelected, you love his tax cuts for the rich or whatever. Tell me that we have checks and balances in this country for a reason, and that Donald Trump cannot continue his behavior here. The founders created the People's House to prevent exactly this type of autocratic authoritarian despotism, okay? A despot is a ruler who holds absolute power, typically one who exercises it in a cruel or oppressive way. Trump doesn't actually have absolute power, but unless someone stops him from behaving as if he does, he has effectively, pragmatically, absolute power. And Trump is doing this by saying, screw the law, screw the separation of powers. I'm just not going to let the House do what it was created to do. And so much of what the founders did was meant to stop presidents from being above the law. When the special counsel says we had substantial evidence, we had 11 possible obstruction counts, but it's politically messy to indict a president, that makes the president above the law. When the House does the right thing, They request documents the correct way in order to investigate. And the White House says, nah, no documents, no testimony. That becomes a White House that is above the law. It's not what Madison wanted. It's not what the founders wanted. And this is actually bigger than Trump, which is why I'm sort of waiting, maybe stupidly, maybe naively. I'm waiting for the constitutional conservatives to say, we've had it. Maybe we voted for Trump. Maybe Hillary would have been worse in their eyes, of course. But this is about the foundational principles of the country and whether they matter anymore. The right wants these constitutional fights around, like the Second Amendment. Which guns can we have based on the Second Amendment? Forget for a second that we have a constitutional right here that is even more important, and it's about whether the president is totally immune from consequences for their actions. The founders gave us the tools: impeachment, congressional investigations, congressional subpoenas. Trump is ignoring them all. And if he's allowed to do it with no consequences, then he is effectively an unchecked autocrat. I'm ready for the constitutional conservatives to say no more. But I have a feeling I'm going to be waiting around for a long time, and that voting in November of 2020 is going to be a much faster remedy. But I'll say it again. If you're a Trumpist who is ready to take the right moral position and say, this can't continue, checks and balances can't be ignored and flouted in this way, get in touch with me. I want to hear from you. Make sure you're following The David Pakman Show on Instagram at David Pakman Show. We will have a poll related to this before you know it. While you're there, also follow me. I'm on Instagram at david.pakman. We'll take a quick break and be back after this.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's great to welcome to the program today for what I think will be a really great conversation, Lee McIntyre, who's a research fellow at the Center for Philosophy and History of Science at Boston University. He's the author of the new book, The Scientific Attitude, Defending Science from Denial, Fraud, and Pseudoscience. Lee, so great to talk to you today.
Great. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
So to get the audience sort of acclimated to what we're going to be talking about, in the book, you outline that there is a sort of denial and a resistance to science as an institution, sort of above and beyond specific topics, which we can get into in more detail later, that really needs to be met head on. And you actually propose in the book exactly how that should be done. Let's first make the case that this is an issue. I mean, for someone in the audience who is skeptical that there is this anti-science movement, how can we explain to them that this exists?
Well, I think it's a great question. And I mean, what you have to do is to pay attention to the fact that the anti-science or the science denial happens in many different areas. Anti-vax, climate change denial, flat Earth is on the rise. People who deny evolution by natural selection. If you look at any one individual case of that, you might think, well, it's only a few people. But cumulatively, what you realize is that the standard of reasoning around scientific issues has really eroded in this country, and that science denial is on the rise.
One of the things I've suggested, and I'm sort of open to it being right or wrong or partially right, is that if you look at anti-intellectualism and pseudo-intellectualism, that pseudo-intellectualism may actually pose a bigger danger in the sense that it's the difference between those who say, I don't think X really matters at all, versus those who say, you know, I've looked at a little bit about this. I've read, maybe in the world of politics, for example, I've read some of those pop politics books by people like Laura Ingraham and Tucker Carlson, and therefore I now am as informed as anybody else. My instinct has been that the latter, the pseudo-intellectualism, can actually be more dangerous. Within the context of science, where do you think that the truth is on that?
I think you're absolutely right. One thing that happens is a lot of people these days have a degree from the University of Google, right? They get on the internet and they find something and they don't know whether it's reliable or not. But after Googling around or hearing someone speak, they think that they know the facts. And empirical evidence has actually shown that it's much harder to convince somebody who knows a little bit about a topic than somebody who doesn't know anything. I mean, that goes back to Socrates, who said that ignorance was not as dangerous as false knowledge. You know, the people who think that they have the right arguments, they're just not willing to listen anymore. So I think you're dead on with that.
Is this problem in the realm of science, science skepticism, so to speak, is it worse in the United States than in other sort of, I guess we could say, other countries in general, but maybe specifically worse than in other Western, wealthier countries?
Well, I mean, we're number one for a lot of these. There are actually rankings on science denial for some specific areas. It turns out that we're number two for denial of evolution by natural selection. The country of Turkey is worse than us. They actually banned teaching evolution in their public schools. But we are definitely number one for climate change denial. Interesting thing about that, based on the recent survey, is that China turns out to be the most enlightened nation in the world on the subject of climate change denial, and they're the worst polluter. So that's really kind of an interesting thing, and I think shows you that it's not just about politics, it's about reasoning strategy.
When you look at the flat earth movement in the United States, and, you know, there's debate over how much of that movement is sort of satirical in nature, but at least some significant portion of it is not satirical. There's really no way to deny that.
That's right.
What do you make of the growth of that movement?
Well, I don't know if you know this, but I went to the Flat Earth Convention in Denver in November of 2018.
Yeah.
And there were 600 Flat Earth folks there and me. And the first day I went incognito. I mean, I bought the badge and I went because I study science denial and I wanted to see what was up. And I'm here to tell you, they were serious. They were not, it was not satirical. There were true believers aplenty. There were seminars, how to recruit new folks for Flat Earth. And it's a growing, rising movement. I think within 10 or 15 years, there are going to be Flat Earthers running for school board and trying to get us to, quote unquote, teach the controversy in the public schools. Same way that they're now doing for climate change. Same way that happened a decade or more ago with evolution by natural selection. It's a growing movement, but they are absolutely dead serious about this. They think that they know the truth, and the rest of us have been brainwashed.
One of the things that I've experienced myself when talking, either it could be to flat earthers, could be to vaccine deniers, it doesn't really matter who, is that you often start the conversation about the merits of the particular subject. Like it's a conversation about flat earth versus spherical earth, for example. But then at a certain point, it gets into the more general distrust or that comes from a misunderstanding of what science is and the scientific method. There's often this idea that, listen, science has been wrong. The conclusions of science have been wrong in the past. Therefore, science as a process is what is problematic. How can you start to unwind that part? Because if you don't unwind that, you can't even really talk about the subject matter.
Yeah, another good point. I mean, the way to handle something like that is to make sure that you're not buying into one of the myths of science. And I think that one of the myths of science that a lot of science deniers buy is that science has to prove something, that science is about certainty. And in actual fact, science, that's just not the way that science works. Anytime you're trying to gather empirical knowledge, you always have the idea that, you know, maybe your study can be overthrown by some future data. But what people fail to realize is that's not a weakness of science. That's a strength, the being able to deal with and even learn from uncertainty. What happens with folks who are not scientists, or who I'll say who don't want to believe in science, is that they take uncertainty as a weakness and an opportunity to exploit for their own views. I think that this idea about science embracing uncertainty is really something that's endemic, and it has been for a long time. What happened recently, though, is that people have stopped trusting experts about a number of things. There's a terrific book by Tom Nichols called The Death of Expertise, where he talks about this. It's not just for science, it's for many different things. But the effect in science is that if people don't understand something that a scientist says, they'll say, well, what do you know? I'll go look it up on Google.
Yeah, and I think that the problem with a lot of that is, so on the one hand, I'm familiar with the book and it brilliantly points out what you're talking about. The other problem is that there is this thing called the media expert industrial complex, for lack of a better term, where people who are just kind of like partisan political actors
Yeah.
are regularly interviewed in media as experts when they're not. So it's sort of like people are right to be skeptical of individuals identified as experts in some ways, but on the other hand, it's having this very detrimental effect within the field of science. And I don't know how we deal with that problem.
It is a real problem, because if you look at the way that scientific issues are covered in the media, and I have to say especially on television, they often engage in false equivalence because it's so easy to have a split screen. They'll have somebody from NASA on one side, somebody with a website on the other. They'll give them equal time, and then at the end say, well, it's a controversial issue, you decide, turning to the audience. That's not the way to present scientific issues. They often, the media, because they're looking for an angle, they want to stir controversy where there isn't one, which was disastrous for anti-vax. I mean, look at the trouble that we're having now. And it's because of all the media attention pretending that there was a controversy where there's really not. I think the same thing happened with climate change. It's really irresponsible to have that sort of false equivalence. Happens all the time in the political arena with predictable results. When it happens with science, I think you face a real problem, because the halfway point between the truth and a lie is still a lie.
Can we talk a little bit about what methods you think are effective to kind of disabuse people of these false notions, either about science in general or about particular issues if you want? And the way I would sort of frame it is, we know that as a general kind of behavioral economics, cognitive psychology, sort of rule or understanding, that just giving people contradictory facts to what they believe usually backfires. It often has the effect of making people just seek out more confirmatory evidence for what they already believe. The measles outbreaks is an interesting one, where one might imagine, well, hold on, in growing anti-vaccine communities, there is a growing problem with measles outbreaks. You would think that that would get people to re-examine their beliefs, but it doesn't really seem to work this way.
Well, it can. And there were great studies on this and the backfire effect. And, yes, if you just ram evidence down people's throat, but they're not willing to hear it, then you've got a problem. But there is some other experimental evidence, some studies which have shown that that's precisely what you should do. You should make sure that people hear the facts. Now, the context in which they hear the facts is important. If you make people feel stupid or you yell at them, then they're much less inclined to believe you. But for instance, in the way that they're handling the measles outbreak in Washington State, they're having workshops. They're sending public health officials and physicians out to talk to people one-on-one or in small groups. And that seems to be working. It's what I tried to model when I went to the Flat Earth Convention. I wasn't just trying to learn from them. I was trying to convince them. And I can't say that I convinced anybody, but I went in with this idea. You convince people by listening to what they have to say, treating them with respect, and then gently showing them where they're wrong. Just if they're willing to engage in actual debate, you should do that. One problem, I think, is that people have underestimated the growth of science denial, and scientists in particular are not willing to have these debates. They walk away from these debates. And meanwhile, science denial is growing and growing, and it's now at the level of the Senate or even the White House, and we've got a real problem on our hands.
Yeah, that's one of the things we've talked about on my program for a while, and people will regularly call in and they'll talk about, not in this particular context, but for example, with the challenging, dangerous extremist ideas. When is it worth ignoring them versus when is it worth actually having conversations and pushing back? And I don't know that in the political space, there's a one-size-fits-all answer. What I've said is, when my assessment is that the ideas are prevalent enough that left unchecked, they could grow out of control, I want to make an effort to challenge those ideas. But I don't know how you make that calculus on the science side.
It's tough. I mean, if you're having a values debate, you probably can't convince somebody. You'd like to think that if it were an empirical debate, that eventually people will, that you could make some progress on something like this. And so, it is probably more difficult in the political arena than it is in the empirical arena. But you do find people in the empirical arena changing their mind. I remember the story a few years back of the mayor of Coral Gables, Florida, who is a staunch Republican, 4 days into his mayorship, changed his mind on climate change, and it was because he saw the reality of what he was dealing with. So it's very hard to change people's mind, but I think it's almost impossible unless you engage them in debate and try to control the terms of the debate. That is, make it about facts. Or I'll tell you one question that I used with great effect at the Flat Earth Convention. What evidence would it take to convince you that you were wrong?
Yes, the defeasibility test, which I was first introduced to by Peter Boghossian, actually, but I know is something that's been around for a while. Very, very effective in my experience as well.
It stopped them. They couldn't really answer it. I'm not sure how much ground I made on it, but it stopped them in their tracks because I don't think they'd ever heard that question before.
We've been speaking, at least in part, about what's in the great book by Lee McIntyre, The Scientific Attitude, Defending Science from Denial, Fraud, and Pseudoscience. Lee, really a pleasure having you on.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
So Donald Trump's been caught lying once again, but this time it's not about which porn star he had sex with and paid off. This time it's about more serious issues, including our relationships with Saudi Arabia, with what's going on with gas prices, and it's a very, very strange series of lies. It started with Donald Trump claiming last week that he called up OPEC, which is a 14-country organization related to oil and oil prices. And it's a really important organization when it comes to the sort of status quo of our use of fossil fuels. Now, obviously, I would like to get to a place where OPEC is irrelevant, but there's no denying that right now OPEC is relevant. And Trump claimed that he called OPEC and said, you've got to bring prices down. When OPEC was asked about this, they said, Trump didn't call us. We haven't spoken to Trump. Trump then said, well, I spoke to Saudi Arabia about increasing the oil supply. And then Saudi Arabia likewise said, no, he didn't. And this is yet another one of these examples of malignant, weaponized narcissism combined with compulsive lying. Trump was on the tarmac Friday about to fly to, I believe, the NRA rally, NRA meeting or whatever. And he said, maybe it was Saturday, and he said, quote, the gasoline prices are coming down. I called up OPEC. I said, you've got to bring them down. You've got to bring them down. And gasoline's coming down. This was denied by OPEC to the Wall Street Journal. So what does Trump do? He doubles down on it with another lie, tweeting, quote, spoke to Saudi Arabia and others about the increasing oil flow. All are in agreement. The California tax on gasoline is causing big problems on pricing for that state. Speak to your governor about reducing economic numbers, 3.2 GDP for what is often worst quarter, looking good. So at this point, it was sort of like conceivably possible if we give Trump the benefit of the doubt. And at this point, I'm not sure why we would, because he lies all the time. But imagine we give Trump the benefit of the doubt. Maybe what Trump meant when he said he spoke to OPEC is he talked to OPEC members like Saudi Arabia, which he then clarified in his tweet. But then we heard from Saudi Arabia that Trump also didn't speak to the Saudi energy minister. He didn't speak to the crown prince. He didn't speak to the Venezuelan oil minister, who right now is the OPEC president. OPEC rotates who the president is. He didn't speak to the OPEC secretary general. So applying our version of Occam's razor to Trump, we call it Trump's razor. When looking to explain Trump's behavior, you err on the side of the stupidest possible explanation. If that's that he just made it all up and none of it is true, then we go with that. And in this particular case, I think that that is the most likely explanation. The lies are relentless. 10,000 people were at my rally. Well, the fire department says 6,000 is the capacity and that there were not more than 6,000 people. I spoke to the president of Puerto Rico. Well, you're the president of Puerto Rico. Who is it exactly that you spoke to? And the really important thing for our purposes here is that Trump made this up, but oil prices still dropped after he said it. And there are some people on the right, if you look online, who are saying Trump's brilliant. It wasn't true that he talked to OPEC. It wasn't true that he talked to Saudi Arabia or whoever. But Trump got us lower prices by saying that he did, and it's genius. That's not how things work, okay? Every time you do that, you create a debt on the other side of the ledger, right? Trump lies. The lies have a real, immediate impact on the world before we find out that they're lies. And then it falls apart. And at some point, that has an impact. Those are not lies that you can tell. It's sort of like burning the candle on both sides, I guess you would say. And it's reasonable to mention again that Trump blaming California for increased gas prices, that's not true. All of these specific things that Trump is saying aren't true. But we really need to be having a totally different conversation, which is rather than trying to lower gas prices by calling OPEC or calling Saudi Arabia, we should be working feverishly, like it's an emergency, because it actually is, to end our dependence on petroleum anyway. But that's like 3 levels removed from where Trump is operating, and it's probably not reasonable to think that that's something he's going to be working on. But once again, weaponized ignorance, narcissistic compulsive lying, and it's having a real world impact. Okay, I don't yet have new polling about how Joe Biden's formal announcement that he's running for president has impacted his standing in the 2020 Democratic primary, but we do have fundraising numbers from Biden's first 24 hours. And he's raising a lot of money. Now, why is he raising a lot of money is what matters, and we'll get to that in a second. But in his first 24 hours after his presidential announcement, Joe Biden raised more money than any other 2020 Democratic candidate in their first 24 hours. Now, there are some caveats, and we're going to discuss them. I told you on Thursday when we talked about Joe's announcement that, politics aside, this is the biggest shakeup to the race since Bernie Sanders announced that he was getting in. And one of the impacts of Joe Biden's announcement is that a lot of the other centrist Democrats are just instantly dead in the water, right? If you're Hickenlooper, if you are Cory Booker or Amy Klobuchar or Julian Castro or Kirsten Gillibrand, and you were sort of hoping to be the safe center-left moderate Democratic vote, Joe Biden entering absolutely crushes and destroys you. But there's still the question of, okay, is Joe Biden going to be able to raise money? And so far, the answer is yes. Joe Biden raised $6.3 million in his first 24 hours after announcing. This came from 96,000 people with an average donation of $65. For comparison, Beto raised $6.1 million in his first 24 hours, and Bernie raised $5.9 million in his first 24 hours. Now, what is very different about Joe Biden than Bernie Sanders, less different than Beto O'Rourke, but very different from Bernie, is that Joe Biden is raising money from very different people than Bernie Sanders. For example, Thursday night, Joe Biden went to a fundraiser hosted by Comcast's executive vice president. He has a big Google fundraiser coming up in May with Google's CEO. Bernie, on the other hand, had way more individual donors, about 225,000 in those first 24 hours. So this is exactly as predicted. Biden is a centrist Democrat. He's more in line with Hillary Clinton. Bernie Sanders is not. So it's not a criticism, although I lean more in the Bernie direction than the Biden direction. But Democrats need to understand that we're kind of in a tough place here because we need to talk about this. I'm going to talk about how Democratic candidates are funded. I did a story about Beto O'Rourke removing that no lobbyists pledge from his website. Here I am telling you how Joe Biden is funded. But the right is very clever, and the right is already using these differences to play up internal divisions within the Democratic Party. Fox News immediately wrote an article about how Elizabeth Warren is slamming Biden for his swanky private fundraiser. So let's vote our policy. Let's start thinning the field, which is going to start happening soon. But let's do it in a way that doesn't hurt us in November, because otherwise it's another 4 years of Trump. And we learned since 2016 that Trump and Hillary were not the same. They would not have governed the same way. The Supreme Court is a great example. So we need to make sure we're striking a reasonable balance between, I'm going to tell you who's funding Bernie, who's funding Kamala, who's funding Joe Biden and Beto and everybody else. but we need to do it in a way that is not sort of piggybacking on and allowing the right to further internal strife within the Democratic primary, because the end result of that is another 4 years of Donald Trump, and we just can't afford it in the literal sense, in the proverbial sense, and we've got to be really careful about it. But so far, Joe Biden raising a lot of money from fewer donors, larger average donation, and some large corporate fundraisers as well, which is not a surprise. We knew that if Joe Biden announced that's who he was going to be raising a lot of money from, and he is, it doesn't change anything. We just need to decide what it is that we want. We have a voicemail number. That number is 219-2-DAVID-P. Last week, I had an interview with former Senator and 2020 Democratic presidential candidate Mike Gravel, and we talked about his beliefs around 9/11 and conspiracy theories, and it really activated a lot of conspiracy theorists in our audience, including this one who called in saying, I am one of them. I am one of them. Take a listen to this.
I just wanted to call and let you know that I thought you were rather disrespectful to Senator Gravel, and your attitude was poor, was not like a journalist, and I won't be watching anymore. I understand where you're coming from now. You're one of them. You're one of these people. Yeah, I think you're trying to cover up what was done that day. Piece of crap.
Right. Yeah. I'm trying to cover up the truth about what happened on 9/11 because why is it that I would do that? So once again, listen, I mean, the term journalist, I'm not a journalist in the sense that I'm a reporter who just asks questions and doesn't give my opinion. This is an opinion show, okay? There are many programs that are not opinion shows. There are many programs that are opinion shows but pretend not to be, and maybe you're getting tricked by some of those. We've talked about that as a media literacy issue, but this is a program where I give my opinion. You can disagree with my opinion. Absolutely, you are free to never watch this program again or listen to this program again. But I am one of them is an extraordinarily conspiratorial allegation, and absent any evidence, probably should drop it. But if you have some way to defend the claim that I am, quote, one of them, and I'm involved in some conspiracy to spread some sort of version of 9/11's events that I know is false, but have some kind of reason to spread anyway, give me some evidence. Give me some evidence that that's going on, and I will gladly address it on the program. We have a great bonus show for you today. Turmoil continues to deepen within the National Rifle Association as President Oliver North is ousted. The University of Virginia basketball team is declining to visit the White House after winning a championship. Would they have done the same if President Obama was still president? I think we know the answer to that, but we will discuss on the bonus show. And lastly, a father has been arrested after accidentally shooting their 6-year-old child with during a gun safety lesson. And we're going to talk about what some call accidental shootings. I prefer to call them negligent, unintended discharges of a firearm. We will talk about all of that and more on today's bonus show. Don't miss it. Become a member, become a patron to get instant access.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.